Is the story of Adam and Eve more than just a myth? What if humanity was crafted by beings from another world? The Knights Templar, keepers of ancient secrets, holding knowledge that could unravel the true origins of man. Do we really understand how life began on this planet? What mysteries lie hidden in our past? As civilizations rise and fall, are we doomed to repeat history? Or is this just the beginning of something greater? Delve into the mysteries that could redefine everything we know about our past and our future. This is more than history. It's the key to rebuilding the world.
My name is Timothy Warren Hogan, and I'm the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. We have a story to tell about the history of the Templars and their incredible discoveries they discovered from the ancient world going back to Atlantis. But in order to tell this story, we need to start somewhat in the middle, as it were. And our story really needs to begin in Scotland. Scotland connects not only to the Masonic traditions, which were intimately connected with Freemasonry, but to me personally, to my family line, to my family history. I had many family members in the past who were Templars and who were involved in Freemasonry, which was connected with Templarism. My great-grandfather was one of the fathers of the American Revolutionary War. I had another great-grandfather who was heavily influential in Freemasonry in Scotland. So in order to tell this story, I can think of no better place to go than to the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So come with me as I go to the Grand Lodge of Scotland so that we can look at the archives there and some of the materials that help to pinpoint this story in history.
Timothy, we're here at the Museum of the Grand Lodge of Scotland here in Edinburgh, and as you will appreciate, there are a lot of artefacts, ancient artefacts, which are truly exciting in this museum. But there is something very special, which is going to truly excite you. I know your family are related to Burns, the ancient family going back, but there is things in here that are really going to excite you, and I can't wait to show you. So, Timothy, what I want to do is introduce you to this painting. Now, this painting shows the inauguration of Robert Burns as Poet Laureate of Lodge Canongate Kilwinning. Lodge Canongate Kilwinning No. 2 is the oldest lodge room in the world, still extant. This was painted by Brother William Stuart Watson, and it shows Burns being inaugurated on the 1st of March 1787. The painting itself was presented to the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1862 by Brother James Burness. James Burness is a direct descendant of Robert Burns, Burness being the ancient family name of Burns before it was changed.
The beginning of the Knights Templar started in 1096 when two knights, one who was a Moor named Hugh de Paynes, and another knight by the name of Godfrey de St. Omar, came together and shared their understanding from different backgrounds of the belief in an ancient civilization that was very advanced. At first, the understanding of this civilization had to do with the writings of Genesis, and in particular, the story of Noah and his flood. There was a belief that there had been a high civilization that existed prior to a great flood, but that there was remnants that had survived this great flood and had preserved aspects of this civilization, preserved the philosophy, the technologies, and wisdom from the ancient world. Godfrey de Saint Omer and Hugh de Paynes set out to find out more about this. And this journey took them from France into Constantinople. There, in Constantinople, they went to a church known as the Church of St. Sergius and Bacchus, that was said to contain an order that existed known as the Brothers of the East. This group, known as the Brothers of the East, which had originally been founded in Greece in 1057, and then had moved to Constantinople and had settled in this building that had been designed by an alchemist. Here they set up plans to preserve knowledge, what they knew about this pre-civilization, and they initiated Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de Saint Omer into a tradition and gave them a mission to start what was to become known as the Order of the Temple, later to be known as the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de Saint Omer met with one of the greatest scholars of the day in Constantinople, a man by the name of Michael Psellos. He had been an author of numerous books, and another important figure by the name of Theoclete, who was also a member of the church at the time, gave them the mission to go to Jerusalem, to assemble a team together to go to Jerusalem and find certain artifacts. Hugh de Paynes and Godfrey de Saint Omer went back to France. They met with 7 other knights, and they took these people back to Jerusalem. There in Jerusalem, they met with Pope Urban II, who granted them land next to what was believed to be the ruins of King Solomon's temple. Here they set up their activity, and they were given the stated mission to protect all pilgrims in the Holy Land. Well, there were 9 knights, and obviously 9 knights couldn't protect all the pilgrims in the Holy Land, but this proved to be somewhat of a cover. For what they really were doing for the next 9 years was digging and doing archaeological work under the Temple Mount. As they dug more and more, they began to find artifacts that pointed to proof of this civilization. And they also found other items that proved to be embarrassing at best, and maybe even considered heretical to the standard Roman Church dogma at the time. Reporting this back to the Pope, who was the only person they had to answer to, it was arranged that they just keep this quiet and they keep doing their digging and their excavations. Within time, they realized that the things they began to find under the Temple Mount proved that there was indeed this ancient civilization that was very advanced. And so they began to seek out other groups that knew more about it. At this point, they began to adopt the red equal-armed cross they had found being used all over the ancient world, in particular by what were known as the Anunnaki of the ancient Sumerian civilization. This equal-armed cross could be found on the outfits and the carvings of the Anunnaki from ancient tablets and reliefs from Sumeria. So the Templars then adopted this symbol as their main symbol and went out and began to seek and find other remnants of this civilization. Ultimately, it led them back into Egypt. They set up shop at the Temple of Isis at Philae, and at this point, they began to look for more evidence of this civilization. At this point, they needed to have a structure for the organization, and they needed to create what was known as a rule for how their membership would operate and what they could and couldn't do and how they would be organized. In order to do this, they again went to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was, as mentioned, he was a leader within the Roman Church at the time. He was also a secretly practicing Druid, and he was good friends with Shlomo Yitzhaki, better known as Rashi of Troyes, France. Rashi was a very famous Qabbalist within the Jewish mystical tradition, studying Kabbalah. In order to draft this rule, he created a rule composed of 72 articles. Each of these articles was said to correspond to one of the 72 Kabbalistic names of God. With this order in place, they set to work to structure their organization to continue the work of research with their meeting of different groups around the Mediterranean and in Africa and even parts around Europe. One of the things they came to learn about was that some of these groups were preserving Greek and Roman texts, which were not known in Europe at the time, particularly the writings of Plato. And within these writings of Plato, they came to learn of the name of this ancient civilization, which was known as Atlantis. This Atlantis was said to be a very advanced civilization, was able to do things that they had only dreamed of being able to do, both technologically and spiritually. So they sought to find more evidence of this civilization. With this, they began to dig more in other places, including in Egypt, and studying the temples in Egypt and studying the temple walls, in particular the Edfu, what came to be known later as the Edfu building texts, which spoke of an advanced civilization that had had a cataclysm and then had passed on information to the Egyptians, and that the Egyptians had inherited some of the knowledge from this. Standard historians have said that the Templars were actually enemies, if you will, to Islam. But early on, the word, the old Norman French word for temple was Allah. And so they were known as the Order of Allah, or the Order of the Temple. And the Templars, through Hugh de Paynes, who became nominated as the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar, through his Moorish family background, they were given fatwas, which was a rule from Islamic tradition, giving them permission to occupy certain areas and to dig, and even be given help in digging. One of the things that they came across near Jerusalem recounted as certain clay jars. And when they broke these jars open, they discovered new texts that were associated with the Bible and also with Kabbalistic theory, in particular the foundations of a text known as the Zohar. Because the Templars couldn't translate all of these texts that were clearly written in Aramaic and Hebrew and languages that they weren't completely familiar with, they had to take them to trusted Jewish sources. One of these texts proved to be the foundation aspects of a text known as the Zohar. The Zohar had information in it that pointed to knowledge of the earth and navigation on the earth that the Templars weren't aware of before. After a short period of time, One of the things that the Templars began finding, a series of boxes, which through their own understanding of the Old Testament, they knew these boxes fit the description of what came to be known as the Ark of the Covenant. These arks, and I say arks because they discovered multiple arks. The boxes were a form of electrical capacitor, and they would build up static electricity, and if you touched them, it would shock you to death. So they had to learn how to deal with this. And they had to also learn how to move these things out of the Holy Land into other locations, to preserve them until they could figure out what they were. Amidst all of this was the challenge that the Roman Church at the time was wanting this knowledge to bring back to Europe so that they could use it for their own influence within Europe. And the Templars quickly realized that it would be irresponsible to turn some of this over to any one authority because it could be abused. So they needed to figure out what they were going to do with it. Therefore, they set up a series of vaults between Palestine into Lebanon, Portugal, and all the way up into Scotland to preserve some of this knowledge temporarily until they could find a place to deposit it. This is the beginning of the real mission of the Templar Order. Shortly thereafter, the Roman Church knew that the Templars were sitting on information and artifacts that could be a problem for the Roman Church. And so they were willing to give the Templars authority and give them permission to do things that they wouldn't allow most people to do. In time, the Templars began to move more artifacts and more knowledge from these groups and from the things they were finding in the Holy Land back into Europe. And they built up their organization. And they did this because most people, when they think of the Templars, they just think of knights on horseback defending people, but they actually became the first multinational corporation. They had farmers that had to grow food. They had sea captains, and they had to build ships to transport people from Europe into the Holy Land and elsewhere. They had scribes who began to translate and to copy texts that they were finding. They also had stonemasons. In fact, one of the earliest rules of the Templar Order specifically outlined that the only people that were allowed to wear gloves within the Templar Order were the priests Templars, whose job it was to serve communion to those who wanted it, and the stonemasons within the Templar Order. Within a short period of time of only 200 years, the Templars built over 1,000 Gothic structures around Europe and began to build what were later to become known as the Gothic cathedrals of France. These Gothic cathedrals were built to preserve some of the knowledge that they were carrying over and finding from their archaeological work, including what were to become the Gothic cathedrals of France, known as the cathedrals of Notre Dame and cathedrals of other places. But here, we need to go back to some of the Atlantean mysteries and secrets that they were preserving. They had already found these arks, which had tremendous power. They had also learned that within these arks was a substance that they assumed was manna, because that's what it was referred to in the Bible. But this powder, this white powder, had a very mysterious properties to it. They found it was able to heal things, heal the body, incredibly fast. It stimulated consciousness, and they figured out that there were ways of producing it. By looking at the Egyptian walls, they began to piece together how to produce this substance. Between the Egyptian walls and the meeting with the different groups that were preserving aspects of this, they began to produce this. And this actually led to Templars living much longer than the average people at the time. They also, as in their digging, they began to find maps, ancient maps that were alluded to territories across the ocean that had never been explored. And they discovered, later to be recognized as the magnetic compass. So the Templars were actually the first to use a magnetic compass, and these were presumed to be remnants of this ancient civilization. So as the Templars went down into the Holy Land, one of the things that they were charged with looking for was texts related to esoteric information describing other aspects of Genesis from the Torah. They started finding these artifacts, but they also began to find scrolls. In fact, one of the things they discovered, which was fundamental to their understanding of the Bible, was a text known as the Zohar. The Templars, rather than handing this discovery over to the Vatican, instead gave it to Jewish communities in Spain who they knew would be able to not only transcribe it, but take care of it. The same publishing company who published the Zohar for the first time in Toledo also became the same publishing company that published the book Parzival for the first time. This is significant because Parzival is a book which was the first Grail story that was published in the 1200s, specifically said that it was the Templars who were the guardians of the Holy Grail. This has led many to believe that there must be some sort of a relationship between these Grail romances and the Zohar itself. Both of which were published by the same people in Toledo in the early 1200s. The Zohar describes a blueprint for how creation is formed, consisting of 10 emanations or aspects of God's consciousness, connected by 22 pathways, each corresponding to one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, with a hidden 11th or 33rd, while forming 32 combinations in all, with a hidden 33rd sphere. The entirety of this diagram, which has come to be known as the Tree of Life, has also been known as the face of God. It's another name for the layout of this tree. Or in Hebrew, the word partsuf means face. And the article of El, or Al, is the article for God. So the partsuf El, or the face of God, becomes Parzival within the Grail romances. And in this story, Parzival, it says that the Templars are the guardian of the Grail. The Zohar mentions that there are 7 continents and one of them is not populated, and that the earth is round, and that the earth goes around the sun. In a section called Vayikra, the Zohar describes how as the earth rolls as a ball, so that while some are on top, others are down. And while for some the sun shines, others are in dark. And there's a place where there's daylight all the time except for a little time of darkness. So this text, which at first just seemed to be another aspect of the Bible, potentially, another aspect of Torah, now was proving to be of value in understanding how the earth itself worked. The Templars were able to put all this together and start to set sail for the New World. It was to become the New World of the Americas, centuries before Columbus. The Templars began to establish trade with natives of the New World of the Americas. They began to take knowledge, their secret knowledge of the New World, back to Europe and make plans to eventually set something up there if they needed to. Meanwhile, they kept digging and they kept trying to understand these Kabbalistic texts more. They felt that this had been an incredible gift, an incredible revelation that had been given to them by God, and that they had incredible responsibility with it. They also understood that the Church of Rome at the time did not have the capacity to appreciate what was being found in the Holy Land, and that they had their own dogma that they were trying to sit on, and that to reveal some of this, to try to reveal some of this stuff to the public would have almost certainly meant that it would have just disappeared. There's no way that the Church of Rome would have allowed it. So they had to find ways to protect it. They had to preserve this knowledge. One of the things that the Templars then started to do is they started looking at how do we apply this knowledge to our building that we're doing. They took the ideas of the Kabbalistic tree of life and they started incorporating it into their architecture. In fact, one of the symbols that the Templar order became known for using right about the same time was the cross with 3 arms on it. This new cross, sometimes associated later with the cross of Lorraine, actually had its origins within the Kabbalistic tree of life. It represented the middle pillar with the 3 horizontal steps or 3 horizontal paths going up it. Traditionally, these horizontal paths corresponded to the Hebrew letters Mem, Aleph, and Shin, also known as the mother letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Mem was associated with water, air was associated with Aleph, and Shin was associated with fire. So these 3 provided a blueprint that could be found not only in the human body with the liquid functions at the level of the abdomen, the air at the area of the lungs, and fire or heat emanating from the head, but they applied these things to the layout of King Solomon's temple itself. They reasoned that there was a relationship of as above, so below, as outlined within the Zohar, and that the human body was just a microcosm of the temple, and that the temple became a macrocosm of the human body. And so the Templars, taking this model, began to apply it towards other things like the very cathedrals that they started to build across Europe. So even to this day, as you go into a cathedral, the baptismal font is at the area of the belly button or the abdomen. The choir is at the area of the lungs or the chest, and the sanctuary is at where all the candles are lit, is at the area of the head. And these cathedrals of Notre Dame, Our Lady, represent the Virgin Mary. And so as you leave the cathedral, you go through the arch or the birth canal. And so you become born as the Christ. Well, this was a very heretical concept at the time, but it's something that still exists and is found to this day. And it's found within this association that we find within the Zohar and the Sefer Yetzirah and within the Hebrew alphabet. The original 9 Templars had all come from what were known as Albigensian Gnostic families, with the exception of Hugh de Paynes, the first Grand Master of the Templars, who had come from a Moorish background. Well, all of these groups had already been interpreting the Bible in different ways than Roman Catholic dogma at the time. So they were prone to starting to look at things symbolically. However, with the discovery of the Zohar, this even gave further justification to look at the Bible in these new symbolic ways, or in their opinion, these old symbolic ways, because they believed that this was the original way to look at the Bible prior to the new Roman Catholic dogma getting involved in it. They started to gain a very different perspective of sacred texts. One of the groups that they had met with in the area of Iran and Iraq, modern day Iran and Iraq, was a group known as the Mandeans. The Mandeans were a Gnostic sect who believed that were later to become known as John Christians, because while they were Christians, they put a special emphasis on John the Baptist in the Bible. In fact, they believed that John the Baptist had a role even more significant than Jesus, and that the only reason why Jesus even became a significant thing in the New Testament is because John the Baptist died early. But if John the Baptist hadn't have died early, he would have been the great Savior. He would have been the great teacher of mankind. In fact, some Mandeans have even gone so far as to believe that John the Baptist was Jesus, and that Jesus was just an esoteric name that John the Baptist adopted. Well, when the Templars encountered this, it was a whole new idea, even though they themselves had come from a Gnostic background. So here we need to explain what Gnosticism is. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means direct personal divine revelations. It was a spirituality that did not require the intervention of a priest in order to get to heaven. In fact, even though there were Gnostic communities that had priests, the priest's job was more to fulfill ritual functions. But it was not believed that these rituals actually were like magical practices that gave you access to heaven. Rather, they had symbolic attributes. And if in understanding these symbolic attributes, you came to understand yourself better. And it was through your own knowledge of yourself and your place in the universe and your connection to God, that is what got you into heaven. And that heaven was a state of consciousness that could be experienced here and now, rather than in the hereafter. Very different interpretation. The Gnostics also believed that the death and resurrection of Jesus was a metaphor. They believed that we all have to symbolically die to our attachment to this world, and that we have to symbolically awaken to a greater consciousness, which was known as a gnosis, or divine direct revelation of God, which could be found within ourselves and all around us. In fact, it was believed that our whole purpose of being here in this life was to learn and to wake up to this possibility. And so they interpreted Jesus's crucifixion, symbolic death, and awakening as the symbolic dying of his lower self so he could awaken to a new light of revelation, a new light of gnosis. Sophia was the goddess of wisdom. And in fact, it's believed that even the schools of Pythagoras were celebrating this goddess of wisdom. And in fact, the very word philosophy itself, which was coined by Pythagoras, comes from philo, meaning love, to love or lover, and Sophia, meaning wisdom. So philo, Sophia, lover of wisdom, is where philosophy comes from. And this goddess, Sophia, represented this. The story of Sophia was that she had incarnated into matter and had become totally lost in it. In fact, the stories say that she relished in matter for a long time, and she even copulated with everything in matter, just to come to understand it. And eventually she realized she was totally lost, and then through her own efforts she made her way back to what was known as the Christos, which was the universal consciousness. And when Sophia then wed the Christos, this was the mystery of the bridal chamber. The writings of Paul, where he says we must learn to make Christ our husband, he was applying to this idea of we must be like Sophia, where our soul actually marries the universal consciousness. It was understood that the Sophia represented our soul, and that each one of us fell to this realm that we exist in right now, and that our job is to work our way through it so that, again, we can unite with that universal consciousness. And when this happens, we will experience gnosis, or divine universal consciousness, and we'll experience it firsthand. So one of the things that the Templars did is they adopted as one of their personal symbols, the seal of Abraxas. Abraxas was a Gnostic talisman who was said to be the son of Sophia. And according to the Gnostic cosmology, Abraxas was what was known as an archon, or a ruler, whose job was to keep people enslaved to the material realm until they had the keys to escape it. Once they had those keys, then they can break free to higher levels of consciousness. Abraxas's body was composed of 4 elements. He was a figure with snake legs. He was wearing an apron. He had a whip that he held in his hands, and he had a rooster head. Very strange looking figure. And he had 7 seals or 7 stars going up his body, and he was surrounded by the letters Iota, Alpha, and Omega on the Templar seal. The Templars adopted this because of several reasons. One is it represented the stages of baptism. It was believed that everybody was born into this earth world, which was represented by the serpent legs. The serpent crawls closest to the ground. But you had to be initiated into the realm of water, which was associated with the apron that hung around the abdomen. where all the liquid functions of the body take place. Water was associated with the emotions and the passions. Once you had learned to master your emotions and use them as an energy for transformation, as opposed to being consumed by your emotions, instead of drowning in your emotions, they believed that this was the symbolic of walking on water in the Bible, learning to stabilize your emotions so that they could hold you up as opposed to drowning in them. And then you can move on to the next level of initiation, which was the baptism by air. Air was associated with things of the mind, and it began with the study of the liberal arts and sciences. It was believed that by studying the things of the mind, eventually you came to realize that the mind was just an aspect of a greater mind, a greater consciousness in the universe. And that this was the beginning of being able to waken up to gnosis. Eventually, through study and personal revelation, your attachment to the old self, your attachment to the lower self that simply identified with the physical body, would begin to start to fade away or break down. And at that point, at a certain point, you symbolically died to your attachment to the physical body, and you had a higher self that awakened. And when this awoken, this was associated with fire, and it was associated with gnosis. And in Abraxas, it was represented by the rooster head that calls out to the light of the sun of the new day. The Gnostics referred to themselves as the sons of light. And so calling out to the light of the sun represented this direction towards gnosis. As the Templars studied these things, they met with other Gnostic groups that could be found throughout the Middle East and elsewhere, and compared and shared these philosophies. And they began to interject it into the architecture for the churches and the buildings that they were building throughout Europe. We find this within the Gothic cathedrals, in which the building was built as a giant human body in stone. It represented Mary, which is why it was called Notre Dame, Our Lady. And as it was hoped, the people went in there and attuned with their higher self. As they left it, they could be born as not just a Christian, but as a Christ, with the idea that they became embodiments of the universal consciousness. To further emphasize this idea, in many of the cathedrals that they built throughout Europe, they also incorporated a labyrinth. And this labyrinth represented the journey to Jerusalem, represented the pilgrimage. But rather than having to travel all the way from Europe to the Middle East, it was understood that the Holy Land that they were trying to get to was a place within yourself. And so by walking this labyrinth and meditating on your journey and meditating on who you are as you're solitarily walking this path, at times getting closer to the center and at other times falling away from it, but eventually by the end winding up in the center, you actually wind up in the center of yourself. And it was hoped that here you attain illumination, and so that then you're able to leave. Unfortunately, these same Gnostic ideas while very beautiful and bringing new understanding to religious texts, also became a little bit of a threat to Roman Catholic dogma, because if you don't need the intervention of a priest to get to heaven, well, that's bad for business. So the church became very weary of such ideas. And ultimately, this was one of the things that resulted in one of the Templars' downfalls. When they were eventually suppressed in 1307 and accused of heresy, one of the charges of heresy in particular was associated with their association with groups outside of the Roman Catholic faith and with philosophies and ideas outside of Roman Catholic dogma. Within the Gnostic tradition, they also recognized that just like with Hebrew, in Greek, every Greek letter also corresponded to a number, and so that there were numeric codes all throughout the Bible. And tied to this, they began to look at it in new ways. For example, one of the things they looked at was the story of the crucifixion of Jesus. It should be pointed out that Jesus was said to be crucified at Golgotha, a place which means skull. Well, the human skull has 22 bones in it, just like there are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, just like there are 22 sections of Revelations. The 22nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Tav, which means cross. That's what Tav actually means in Hebrew. And in Greek, which would be the equivalent of the Greek letter Tau, Tau also means cross. Well, in Hebrew, this letter Tav is actually composed of 3 of the Hebrew letter vowels. So if you put 3 Hebrew letter vowels or V's together, they form the Hebrew letter Tav. Well, vow in Hebrew means nail. So at the end of the Hebrew alphabet, you have a cross and 3 nails. Not only that, but vow in Hebrew has a numeric value of 6. And therefore, 3 nails would be 666, which had nothing to do with the devil, but rather it was understood that this was a number of transformation. Transforming from one thing out of the material into the spiritual. So the fact that this exists within the Hebrew alphabet and that Hebrew existed long before Jesus was ever said to be around implied that there was a symbolic code written on the Bible, and that this same symbolic code also applied to the Greek just as much as the Hebrew. The Templars began to look at this, and they began to look at these numeric codes and other symbolic codes throughout the New Testament, finding that, in fact, there appears to be deeper levels of meaning. One of the other things that was also looked at and was considered from a Gnostic standpoint was the spelling of the name Jesus. Jesus was spelled a particular way in Greek, but they wanted to look at how was this spelled in Hebrew. And there were different ways of spelling Jesus in Hebrew, but one of them, which would have been Yeshua in Hebrew, was spelled Yud He Shin Vav He. This was similar to the Hebrew spelling for the name of God, which is Yod He Vav He, only it has the Hebrew letter Shin in the center of it. Shin, as mentioned earlier, was associated with fire. So this became the hidden light, or the hidden fire of God. And with this understanding, it brought on new revelations which related directly to their understanding of what fire represented within the Gnostic tradition. It represented gnosis, or divine knowledge. With all of this understanding and this new interpretation of the Bible, it brought in a good shot of mysticism, both to the Old and the New Testaments, and allowed the Gnostics of the different branches, including the Kabbalists, the Jewish Kabbalists, and the Christian Gnostics, to form close associations within Europe via the Templars. As the Templars came across other Gnostic groups, they found that some of these Gnostic groups had also been studying something known as alchemy. One of the things that the Templars began looking into, or started adopting in particular, was a particular elixir that they created that was known as the wine of Jerusalem. And this particular wine was an aloe extract infused with hashish, which they had gained from their associations with a group known as the Hashishin, which had existed in areas like Syria. The same word of Hashishin later became known as where the root of the word assassin came from, because they were known to be cunning warriors, but they also used this substance known as hashish. In time, these groups also mentioned that the source of this knowledge came from the area of Egypt. And so the Templars, traveling further into Africa, into the Mediterranean, found themselves down into Giza. They had their own traditions of an area called Ras Tau, which later became associated with Ras, came to be associated with rose, and Tau was the Greek word for cross. So it was the land of the rose cross, from which later groups assumed the name of Rosicrucian. But the Templars adopted the symbol of the rose cross, specifically related to this area of Ras Tau in Egypt, which, as it turns out, was the ancient name for Giza. The word alchemy actually comes from alchem, or alchemit, which was the ancient name for Egypt. Turns out that while in Egypt, there was a group preserving knowledge of how certain herbs could have essences extracted from them, and that these essences could be used for making elixirs, which could do all kinds of things. And this was of great value to the Templars, who began to study it. Well, this was of great value to the Templars, who found ways of prolonging their lives and the lives of other people, as well as helping to heal. Up to this point, one of the only things that you could do if you had an infection in let's say a wound, is you could put honey in it, which was a natural antibacterial. Bacteria wouldn't survive more than 10 minutes in honey, so it was a way of helping to seal up the wound. The bacteria would be killed by the honey, which helped it to heal. But creating these new elixirs allowed other new potent ways of fighting disease. Applied to this process, they also believed that the air had a special vital component in it, which later came to be known as the symbolic mercury. In Eastern traditions, this became known as the ki, or the chi, that was within the air. But within the alchemical traditions that the Templars were studying, this became known as the mercury force. And so as the Templars came to understand this, they realized there must be some vital component to breath. And as a result of this, it was actually the Templars who were the first to develop CPR in order to resuscitate people. They reasoned that if there was a vital component in the breath, if they could artificially stimulate breath within people, they could potentially bring them back to life, which in fact they did. And this was deemed to be a miracle. The other thing that the Templars began to work with was certain mold extracts in order to produce medicines from these mold extracts. Well, we would now recognize that today that's something we would call antibiotics. But this was something that the Templars were doing clear back in the 1200s. Through alchemical processes of extracting things out of mold extracts. They learned of this through, again, the groups that they were associating with in Egypt, who had their own traditions. The Templars set up areas of activity both at Dendera and at Philae in ancient Egypt, where they had preceptories and commanderies, and began to study everything they could about the hieroglyphs in the area, and began digging and looking within temple walls and associating with the different groups in those areas. And one of the great treasures that came out of this was further alchemical knowledge. The Templars also came across Hermetic, what were known as Hermetic texts through the Druze or the Tahid's Mohidun group that they were associating with in areas primarily of Syria and Lebanon. And they venerated Hermes as a prophet, and they were preserving Greek Hermetic texts, and some even believe he had a text known as the Corpus Hermeticum, which was a mix of Egyptian and Greek ideas associated with Hermetic philosophy that tied in directly to alchemy. Hermes was believed to be the father of alchemy, so they were passing on these ideas. As the Templars came to understand these things, they incorporated the symbolism associated with this onto the cathedrals that they were building in Europe. Even to this day, if you go to the cathedrals of Notre Dame, you'll find depicted images of figures pulling salamanders out of Athanor ovens, which were alchemical ovens, and images of stars issuing forth essences, and images of Hermes himself being depicted on these cathedrals. Well, these aren't things that are found in the Bible. These are things that are found in Hermetic texts that the Templars are being exposed to with these groups in the Middle East. And the only way you can explain how these things wound up on these buildings in Europe is through the Templar Masons who were incorporating them onto there, because they were the only ones that were traveling back and forth between the Middle East as they associated with these groups and then bringing them into Europe. This is one of the proofs that the Templars were actually involved in the financing and the building and the philosophies that were going into these cathedrals. Not to mention the sciences, the math, and the geometry that went into these things. And to celebrate this memory of this tradition of Ras Tau at Giza, of course, the cathedrals, when viewed from the air, look like crosses, but on all of these cathedrals, they also put these rose windows, thus making them rose crosses. Rose cross, Ras Tau. the ancient name for Giza, from which they were getting this alchemical knowledge. The Templars were known for living for much longer than most people during their day and age, and many people believed it had to do directly with this alchemical knowledge. And in fact, even the book Parsifal refers to the Holy Grail as a stone that burns the phoenix to ashes, after which it comes back renewed. And it says that the Templars used this stone to help keep them young. And they said that this, in the book Parsifal, it says this stone is known as the Grail. Well, this is an alchemical metaphor, and it ties in directly to this idea of preserving this alchemical knowledge that had come from the ancient world, had become lost for a while, and then was rediscovered by the Templars and brought back to Europe. It went even deeper though, because the Templars began to understand that part of the process of this alchemy involves extracting a secret salt. To the Templars, they knew that the sacred texts and these groups referred to this secret salt as the precious white stone and as the hidden manna. They believed this was the hidden manna of the Bible. Within the Albigensian tradition, from which the original 9 Templars largely came out of, they practiced a special ceremony known as the Mani Sola ceremony, which had to do with a communion rite with this white stone, which was said to be these alchemical salts that could be extracted out of things. So the Templars started utilizing this secret salts, this secret hidden manna that could be extracted alchemically in their communion, their secret communion rites and their initiation ceremonies. In fact, it was believed both within the Templar ceremonies and within some of the secret Sufi traditions that were starting to flourish at the time, that they had the same types of initiation ceremonies, one of which was referred to as the sharing of the salt ceremony. And this sharing of the salt was actually the secret manna, the secret white substance that was removed from matter. We now know what this substance is. For a long time, it was believed to be, it was just referred to as manna. Manna in Hebrew means, what is it? And it refers to, it's referred to as manna, or what is it, because it doesn't react to anything. If you do mix it with other chemicals, it doesn't react to anything. So there's no way of knowing what it is that way. If you do a burn test on it, it doesn't, the flame doesn't show up as anything. Therefore, they didn't know what it was, so they called it what it is, which is, what is it? Manna. Well, this was the white stone. This was the manna, and they believed that this was the original stone that was found in the communal rites. And it was this same white stone that was put in the Ark of the Covenant, was believed to be stored in the Ark of the Covenant according to Revelations. And this same white stone was referred to in Revelations, where it says, "To he who overcometh will be given the hidden manna in the white stone." This white stone was said to have tremendous healing properties, so that it actually resulted in, it could be added to any elixir and make it 100 times more potent than it was prior to that. They also found that if they took this white stone and they tweaked it and added certain other substances to it that it would turn red. And this new red substance looked and tasted like blood, and it was 1,000 times more potent than even the mana. And so this red substance they began to refer to as the blood of Christ. And between the mana, the original mana substance, and the blood of Christ, they believed this was the original communion that was being alluded to in the Old Testament with Melchizedek, the prophet Melchizedek, as he initiated Abraham, and later in the New Testament with Jesus. Today we know that this mana is actually monoatomic atoms. It's platinum monoatomic atoms. And that these substances, most atoms bind with other atoms, but when atoms are in a monoatomic state or a high spin state, the outer valence ring of the atom is completely captured by the nucleus, so it doesn't bind with anything. It enters into a high spin state, and each grain of this atom of this substance is 1 atom thick. Because it is white, because it's in a high spin state, it completely reflects light, so it appears it's completely as white. And this is what makes it be the precious white stone, and it has other incredible properties which will become known in the future. The Templars discovered a terrible secret, which, while philosophically it wasn't a problem for them based on their own private secret beliefs, it became a major problem for the Roman Catholic dogma. As the Templars were in Jerusalem, they found a number of different artifacts, and they were digging a number of different places. Certainly they were digging under Solomon's temple and around the area what was believed to be Solomon's temple, or certainly the ruins of the Second Temple. But one of the places they started digging around was other areas of Jerusalem. As they were looking around the area of East Jerusalem, they discovered old tombs. And one of these old tombs that they went into, they found a terrible secret. Breaking through the wall of an old tomb, the Templars had found that oftentimes there were mysteries of private sacred texts, inscriptions, and everything else found within the burial chambers of people. They certainly found this within Egypt. That's something that archaeologists to this day continue to do. But as the Templars were breaking into tombs, literally in the area of East Jerusalem, they came across a particular tomb, and in breaking through the wall and entering inside, they found a series of ossuaries. Now, an ossuary is a stone box, which usually has writing on the outside, and contained within these boxes are bones of the deceased. And sometimes other things are put in there as well, including little jars or jewelry that contain special things associated with that individual. Well, in this particular tomb in East Jerusalem, the Templars found ossuaries that contained within them the names of what appeared to be very significant people from the New Testament. They found a particular ossuary with the name of Yeshua, or Jesus, on it. Another one with Mary of Magdala, which would have been Mary Magdalene. Another one with what appeared to be their children, and another ossuary with John the Baptist. The Templars, having come from a pretty strict theological background, realized this was a bit of a problem of a discovery, because Jesus was said to have bodily raised to heaven, and yet here was an ossuary that seemed to be containing his name, and it was his entire family. Putting the pieces together, they quickly came to realize a dangerous secret, which was not only were Jesus and Mary Magdalene married, but they had children. And it appears that Mary Magdalene had also previously been married to John the Baptist, and that they had children as well, and that they were all buried together inside this tomb. Well, this was a secret that had the potential to destroy the dogma of Christianity at the time. Now, this wasn't too much of a problem for Templars, because in their Gnostic associations, they had come to associate the stories of Jesus as largely being metaphors anyways, and to being applied to us personally. So they interpreted the death and raising of, or awakening, the anastasis of Jesus, which is sometimes interpreted as resurrection, as being a metaphor for our own awakening to higher levels of consciousness. The Gnostics also had a belief in reincarnation, so it wasn't improper from a Gnostic standpoint to consider the fact that we could die and then come back again in a new form while being reincarnated. But to most of the people of Europe, this was a foreign concept, and the idea that it was believed that Jesus had literally achieved bodily resurrection. And in fact, this is something that churches, for the most part, teach to this day. Finding a tomb, what appeared to be the body of Jesus, along with his wife, Mary Magdalene, which again, this is a real problem, because this was not in standard church doctrine as being acceptable either, and that they had children is bad enough, but then recognizing that Mary Magdalene appears to have also had children with John the Baptist, and that Mary Magdalene was married to John the Baptist prior to being married to Jesus, just created all kinds of problems. And it was something that flew in the face of what church dogma was back then, and continues to be to this day. So the Templars, in realizing this, had a real problem. They, of course, reported it to the Pope. And the Pope wanted to do everything he could to keep this knowledge secret. The Roman Church at the time had a business of having people believe that in bodily resurrection and that you had to go through the church in order to do it. This is what kept the church in business, so to speak. That's what allowed them to make money. It's what allowed them to have an influence in the lives of people. And the fear was if people found out that there may be a different way of looking at it, that it could really hurt their standing and their role in all of European society and in fact in the world at large. The Templars immediately took carefully and reverently and respectfully assembled the bones, took them out of the ossuaries. They left the ossuaries there, put them in new boxes, and proceeded to move these artifacts out of the Holy Land, moving them in various stages through different secret transports into Europe, with the idea that eventually they can hang on to this stuff in Paris till they knew what to do with it. With this dangerous secret, the Roman Church pretty much allowed the Templars to do whatever they wanted. The Templars realized that this could actually be a good blackmail chip, if you will, because they could hold this over the church's head and reveal this to the world at any point. And this kind of forced the church's hand for a little while in giving the Templars whatever they needed to help build civilization throughout the rest of Europe. Again, they interpreted the scriptures from a symbolic standpoint. And so they believed that everybody symbolically has to lose identification with the physical world and eventually attain the light of understanding known as gnosis, and that this is where the salvation came in, not in believing in a bodily resurrection. But it was a tough pill to swallow for the Pope, and it remained a dangerous secret. The Templars also knew that the minute they turned this over to the Roman Church, that it would disappear, and they would no longer have it as a bargaining chip. So they proceeded to hang on to these items and pass them around. They also reasoned, well, if Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and they had children, that this was in line with their own Gnostic beliefs, and that Jesus must have represented the Christos and Mary Magdalene must have represented the Sophia, and that the wedding of the Christos and the Sophia was represented within the lives of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. This was philosophically not a problem for the Templars, and they could take this and they could apply it to their own lives. They began to look at Mary Magdalene as more of a high initiate or a priestess within the tradition. She certainly, the role she fulfilled in the Bible was one that they found within the ancient world of the mythos associated with Isis on the Egyptian walls. In the role of Isis in as they were finding at the Temple of Isis at Philae, where in Egypt, where the Templars had their headquarters. And so they had also found these statues of Isis with the baby Horus sitting on her leg. And the Templars started to bring replicas of these over into Europe, and these became the early Black Madonna statues that can be found all over Europe. They reasoned that if Mary Magdalene was a priestess of this tradition, and she represented the Sophia, that those myths of Sophia probably came from these myths of Isis, and that the Black Madonnas then concealed this terrible secret that not only did all this tradition probably come from Egypt, that Mary Magdalene was probably a priestess of the Isis tradition. Jesus himself was probably passing on the Egyptian knowledge. Again, this was philosophically not a problem for the Templars. Even they knew it was counter to what the church doctrine and dogma was at the time. They were already applying these things personally to themselves, where Mary Magdalene represented the human soul as it fell to this world, worked out its problems, and then eventually wed with the Christos, the universal consciousness. So in the same way, it made sense that Mary Magdalene participated in her role in the world, and then married Jesus, who represented the Christos, the embodiment of the Christos. And they reasoned that if they had children, then there must be a lineage that still existed tied to this. This took on a new meaning associated with the Holy Grail, because one of the names for the Holy Grail was Sang Graal, and in a simple word play, this came to be known as Holy Blood, which represented the holy bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. As the Templars brought this knowledge back to Europe, they realized there were, in fact, certain families, certainly within France and also within Scotland, in other words, that were preserving aspects of this tradition, and that the knowledge base that they had found in their travels was also being preserved by these same families. And so they reasoned that the secret of the Holy Blood wasn't some sort of magical powers in the blood. It was the fact that this bloodline was preserving knowledge from the ancient world. Knowledge, in fact, that may go all the way back to the famed lost civilization of Atlantis, and knowledge related to a different interpretation of Scripture. This different interpretation defined a personal relationship between self and a greater God consciousness. And it was reasoned that this bloodline was the protectors of this knowledge. The Templars at this point then set on the new responsibility of protecting those within this bloodline, because they're the ones who could understand and interpret all the knowledge that was being brought back. Later, when the Roman Church decided enough, we can't deal with the Templars having this knowledge. It's too much of a thing that they're able to hold above our head. And when King Philip the Fair of France decided that they needed the Templar resources and money in order to fund his own war campaigns. And he decided to suppress the Templars. The church completely went along with it because they wanted access to the holy treasures and to these holy bones, so that it wouldn't be a problem. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, because the Templars already planned for a day when these things might have to be hidden somewhere outside of Europe. They had already been doing their explorations of the New World. They were already starting to map areas across the Atlantic in North America. And they already began setting to work setting up certain vaults within the Americas to hide artifacts such as these, to ensure they wouldn't fall into the hands of people who would use them for the wrong reasons or who may make them disappear. One of the things that the Templars came across again and again and again, whether they were meeting with the Mandeans in Iraq or as they traveled as far away as India and encountered groups there on the Indian subcontinent, was the role of a goddess figure. They had been exposed to the idea of God, and they knew of the Mother Mary from the New Testament, but here they were talking with traditions that suggested that no, there's a feminine aspect to divinity as well, which at the time was being completely neglected within Europe. Even in Ethiopia, as they looked at the traditions there that talked about King Solomon and his wife, the Queen of Sheba, they had their traditions that talked about the Hebrew god Yahweh. But even Yahweh had a consort or a wife known as Asherah. It became very clear that these models of divinity were androgynous. Even the name Yahweh was composed of the Hebrew letter Yud, which represented the male active force, and Ave, which was actually the word for Eve, and was a female principle, which made Yahweh both a masculine and a feminine attribute. Yahweh himself was said to have a wife by the name of Asherah, and Asherah could be composed of the words Ashe, which was actually Isis from the Egyptian traditions, and Ra, which was the male active principle within the Egyptian tradition. So even this too was a balance of female and then masculine aspects. So they saw this being encountered again and again and again, and as a result, they began to devote themselves to the female principle. Even beyond this, one of the fundamental planets that the Templars were using with their navigation, their sea navigation with celestial alignments, was the planet Venus, because it was very predictable. It aligned 5 times with Earth on the other side of the sun every 8 years, forming a perfect pentagram in the sky. And knowing this, they could use this to map a number of things, and it helped them with their navigations. So Venus then became very significant within their cosmology, and of course Venus herself was a goddess type of figure.
So there's the great goddess, and then there's all these minor goddesses, but really they're all just a metaphor for her, the great goddess. So back in earlier times, we had the Druids, we had all different cultures, the Greeks, that were very much aware of what was going on in their surroundings. They noticed during the change of the seasons, the sun would die, the male deity would die off in the winter, and then he would return. But part of his return was due to the goddess. But this is more an astronomical phenomenon. So we had all these different aspects of the goddess, not only on earth, but in the heavens. And in that situation, back in that time period, as the sun would approach the winter solstice, like it was dying, and all the plants had died and it was cold, people would worry, is it going to come back or is it going to keep going? Well, who would save him? The goddess in the heavens, and it would be Sirius. The star Sirius would be on the horizon at that time. And it just so happened that, as viewed from Earth, it looked like she was stopping the sun. Now, to the Egyptians, Sirius was Isis. So this became something that indicated to humans that the role of the feminine was very important in saving the sun god. So we would then see the change of seasons happen after that phenomenon, and it all got wrapped in lore and associations. So people observed that the sacred feminine, or the goddess, was present as Mother Earth, where life would spring forth in early spring, and as the plants matured and as crops matured, we'd see another thing that would happen in the fall, and that was when the harvest would happen. And at that time, we had another thing that was going on in the heavens, and that was the constellation of Virgo was overhead, also known as the Virgin. So that would be the time period of the ancient mystery schools in Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries, and that was when the harvest was celebrated and the bounty of the goddess was celebrated. So these are all traditions, and of course the most important thing of all was that the females are the life givers. And that's what became part of the whole Templar tradition. And in Freemasonry, it's all saved, because 2,000 years ago we had the Romans. The Roman Catholic Church was trying to demonize the feminine and raise the masculine aspect. Whereas before in history, it had always been a dual nature, male and female, heaven and earth, the balance. It was all in balance, and they tipped it out of balance. The Templar tradition, Freemasonry, it's all preserved in there. Sometimes even the Masons aren't even aware of what's being preserved, but it's in there. My co-author, Alan Butler, who is a Templar expert over in Europe, he and I began working together on some of these concepts. And one of the things that we noticed was about Washington, D.C. that stood out as indicating that there is this goddess tradition that is being preserved there is, first of all, the shape of Washington, D.C. was a diamond. That's a very much a feminine shape that is a symbol of the goddess. Also, the fact that Washington, D.C. is partly in Maryland, Maryland, and partly in Virginia, Virgin land, right, was another indicator. And not to mention, the actual name of Washington, D.C. is the District of Columbia. Columbia being Columbae, which is Latin for dove, also a symbol of the goddess. So just in that aspect alone, we have some goddess indicators. But what's there in the city itself? The city, if anybody who walks around DC will notice immediately that there are many, many, many goddess statues, especially the one that sits on top of the Capitol building, which is Columbia. It's not called that, it's called Freedom officially, but that's really who she is. Columbia is the goddess of the United States of America. And we also see that there are some things in our history. For example, the Constitution was signed in September, the week of September 17th, that time period, and that was on purpose, we believe, because that is the traditional time of the Eleusinian mysteries, the mysteries of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. And at that time period, as I said earlier, that is when the constellation of Virgo is directly overhead. Virgo, the Virgin, also. So we see a lot of these indicators around the city. But one of the really amazing things that we figured out is the Washington Monument itself has a very pronounced shadow that points to things around the National Mall on key dates, where the tip of the shadow touches certain things. But it's the key dates that makes it important. It's not just a big sundial. And one of those is on September 17th, Constitution Day. The shadow goes right up the steps of the Capitol building and knocks on the door. And that's just amazing. We were there in Washington, D.C. not too long ago, last year, for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And we had an opportunity, my husband Scott Wolter and I, to chase the shadow and watch it move towards the Capitol. And it moved a lot faster than we thought it would. But you have to stay in the tip of the shadow to know where it's actually going. And so we did that. And the best way to do that is to stand back, look up at the Washington Monument, use your phone because you can't look right at the sun, take pictures, and what you want ideally to see is the sun sitting right on top of the monument, and it's just fantastic. So we did that, and that was really fun. But a few years before that, we had been out there in the wintertime on the winter solstice, and Alan Butler and I had a theory that the shadow on the shortest, darkest day of the year would actually be the only time of year where it could touch and actually just penetrate the edge of the ellipse, which sits just south of the White House. The ellipse is an egg-shaped or elliptical-shaped open grassy area in the city. And it's really what we now have come to realize is an egg, the sacred feminine. And we were right. At that time of year, the shadow just penetrates the edge of the ellipse. And it's because the sun is at its lowest point on the horizon, and the shadow can reach there. And we were blown away by that. If that's not a sign of commemorating the fertility of the sun with Mother Earth, I don't know what else is. So on the 4th of July, which was another key date in American history, we thought there has to be something that the shadow does on the 4th of July. There's something called the Jefferson Pier, which is a little square, sort of pyramidian-shaped concrete marker. And what it's marking is when Thomas Jefferson was president, he wanted to have a new prime meridian for the United States. And he designated that as 16th Street, which runs north-south down through the White House, down through the ellipse, and beyond, down toward what ended up being the Jefferson Memorial eventually. So there's a little marker there that indicates that was his meridian. Now, it never got passed in Congress, so it didn't happen, and we stuck with the Greenwich prime meridian. But on the 4th of July, the shadow tip touches Jefferson's little pier, which is really cool for the 4th of July. And there's other places, again, like I said, around the mall. But the engineering aspect of being able to construct the Washington Monument and place it where they did at a time period when we didn't have calculators, we didn't have computers. This was all mathematics and astronomy calculations that were done by hand. And I'm blown away by that. There's an amazing alignment in New York City. in Manhattan that is made up of 3 obelisks. One of those obelisks, which was the last one to be placed in its position in the city, is a real Egyptian obelisk that came over on a ship in the 1800s, the late 1800s, 1880, I believe. And they had to actually cut a hole in the hull of the ship to put the obelisk in and then patch around it and send it over here. It's called Cleopatra's Needle. So there was a real Egyptian obelisk that was brought over, and it was paid for by William Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, because he had paid for this, and he was also a Freemason, had the honor of being able to say where the obelisk would be placed in the city. Well, he ended up placing it where is in Central Park now, behind what is now the Met Museum. He placed it there, though, for a reason, because it was to finish what had already been started by earlier Freemasons, which was a line of obelisks that went from south to north that are actually mimic almost exactly the belt stars of Orion, which to the Egyptians, going back in time, was Osiris. Osiris was the god of resurrection. And these belt stars are very important because they point to things in the heavens. In one case, they point to the star Sirius, which was Isis to the Egyptians. And if you go the other direction, they go to Aldebaran, which was the eye of Taurus. And also beyond that, it's a slight angle to Pleiades. Pleiades was another star system that was thought of as a sacred feminine thing, the 9 sisters, they called it. So back to the obelisks in New York, this alignment, if you follow it, it goes from Cleopatra's Needle, going south to the Worth obelisk by the Flatiron Building, and farther south down to St. Paul's Chapel, down by Ground Zero. St. Paul's Chapel has an obelisk there that's the Emmet obelisk, but there's no Emmet buried underneath it. So these obelisks are really what is an amazing temple to Osiris. And we had a clue, Alan Butler and I, when we were researching this, that there was something going on. Because in Grand Central Station, which was built by the Vanderbilts, Grand Central Station has a starry ceiling painted on it. And all the constellations are there. But there's one, and only one, that's painted in reverse. And that's Orion. Why is Orion painted backwards? And the Vanderbilts have been asked about this over the years, and they all smile and say, it's perfectly correct. Because if you know what's going on in the city, if the city is a temple to Orion, Osiris, then it's meant to be viewed from above. And if it's viewed from above, then it's perfectly correct. But there's one thing more. If you follow that line of obelisks out into the harbor, who's out there? Isis, right? The Statue of Liberty, shining her light for all to see. And I think it's just a beautiful, hidden in plain sight example of the goddess being front and center, always present, but carefully veiled to protect her, as she always is in Templarism and Freemasonry.